Hey friends, tonight, let's explore a story of Warts whispers and one very damp ingredient you probably didn't expect in your medieval medicine cabinet. Yes, tonight we're talking about toads, the bumpy, blink slowly kind, the sort that look like they know something you don't. And in the Middle Ages, they weren't just hopping around aimlessly, they were ingredients. So before you relax, take a second to like and subscribe if you find value in what we share. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time you're falling asleep tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through a narrow alley that smells of moldy hay, boiled onions, and wet parchment. The air clings to you like gossip in a small village. You're in front of a wooden door with a faded sign swinging above something that might once have said apothecary if the sun hadn't done such an aggressive job of bleaching it. Inside, it's all shadows and jars. Glass ceramic clay, some sealed with wax, some with fabric tied tight. Dried herbs dangle from ceiling beams like sleepy bats. And right there next to powdered horn and eel oil is a toad, not a sketch of one. A real, very much once alive toad now preserved in something thick and yellowish. Possibly wine. Possibly not. You blink. So does the toad. Sort of. This is your introduction to medieval medicine, where the logic is squishy and the prescriptions might ribbit. Toads weren't just part of back alley superstition. They were genuine components in many medical recipes. If your glands were swollen, your legs ached, or you had mysterious hot humors, a local healer might just suggest apply a toad, whole or in paste form. That depends on your healer's creativity. Now here's tonight's historical fact. Medieval apothecaries and folk doctors across Europe used toads in their treatments for everything from plague buboes to toothaches. Some believed the toad would draw out illness through sympathetic magic, like transferring the ailment from you to the creature. This works great, unless you're the toad. It gets more complicated. Some jars didn't hold just one toad, but several boiled, then mashed into what manuscripts sometimes called unguentum buffonis. It was spread on wounds, swellings, and very confidently on chest pains. Toad poultices, toad powders, and even toad compresses were all part of the medieval pharmacopoeia. The smell, let's not dwell on that. Of course not everyone agreed. While one healer swore by freshly killed toads for reducing swelling, another preferred sun-dried toads roasted over rosemary. The disagreement was academic in the way arguing over which boot to chew on during a famine might be. As you step closer to the shelf, you notice a parchment label, Contra pestum, Buffonum unum. Against the plague, one toad. Simple instructions. Poor toad. You wonder how people came up with this. Well, part of it comes down to the humoral theory. The belief was that the body contained four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and imbalance caused illness. Toads, being cold moist and quite unpleasant to behold, were considered excellent for drawing out excess heat or corruption in the body. That's right. The toad wasn't gross, it was medicinally gross. There's a quirkier detail too. In some folk records, the toad wasn't just medicine, it was the container. People believed you could trap illness inside a toad. One account tells of placing a live toad in a box under a sick child's bed. If the toad died, the illness had been absorbed. If the toad escaped, well, now you had a loose toad and a sick child. Two problems for the price of one. And now here's your gentle academic squabble. Of the evening, some historians argue whether this use of toads was primarily symbolic or genuinely believed to be medicinal. Were they metaphors turned literal, or simply acts of desperation wrapped in folklore? No consensus yet. But the toads didn't get to vote either way. You back away from the jar, just as a very old man in a fur-lined cap leans over the counter. He nods to you with the seriousness of someone who's personally applied powdered toad to their elbow. Needs something for the fever, he rasps. Or just browsing. You say you're just looking, and maybe trying not to breathe too deeply. Behind him, another jar sits in shadow labeled toad marrow for winter coughs. The handwriting is elegant. The concept is not. You thank him and step back out into the alley. The door shuts with a soft thud behind you. And just like that, you've taken your first step into the long, lumpy story of toads in medieval medicine. It won't be the last. And don't worry, no real toads were harmed in the making of this bedtime story. Probably. Oh, and fun fact, before you nod off in some villages, they thought rubbing a toad on your feet cured gout. It didn't. But at least it gave people something to talk about while limping. Or maybe they just really liked having an excuse to touch a toad. Who knows? Warts, wounds, and warnings. You're crouched beside a shallow stream at the edge of a medieval village, listening to the soft burble of water and the even softer sound of someone trying not to scream. A young boy sits on a flat rock nearby, clutching his hand, where a fat red welt has begun to rise like a tiny hill of poor decisions. Standing over him is an elderly woman in too many shawls, holding what else a large, unamused toad. She clears her throat dramatically. "You want it gone," she says. The boy nods. Then we press the toad to the wart, and we wait. You wonder if the toad gave its consent to this arrangement. Tonight's historical fact: in many parts of medieval Europe, toads were used often with unnerving confidence to treat warts wounds and mysterious skin eruptions. It was believed that the toad's cold, moist body could draw out heat and inflammation. Sometimes it was applied directly to the skin. Sometimes it was sliced open and its innards smeared on the sore. And yes, that image will stay with you longer than you'd like. This wasn't some fringe folk trick either. Even educated physicians included these techniques in manuscripts. One 13th century English text solemnly advised, "Take a toad, bind it about the sore, and bury it after 3 days, for the evil shall go with it." That's not medical advice. That's a roommate prank disguised as science. Toads were especially infamous in wart treatment. You know warts, those stubborn little skin mountains that defy logic and lotion. In a time without dermatologists, the nearest solution was either prayer or amphibians. Often both. Some believed that if you rubbed a wart with a toad, the wart would jump onto the animal. This magical transfer required proper timing, a recited rhyme, and the correct direction of rubbing. Left to right, never the other way. Because that would be, obviously, ineffective. There was also the reverse method, placing a dead toad in a bag and tying it around your neck. Apparently, fashion-forward wart removal was a thing. The idea was that as the toad decayed, so would the wart. That may sound grim, but let's be honest, so does the modern method of freezing your skin with liquid nitrogen. At least medieval folks added poetry. Now the funny thing is, warts were not just a cosmetic concern. In many medieval communities, they were thought to be the mark of disease, or worse, dark magic. If your hand sprouted even one bump too many, you might be branded as cursed or contagious. Enter the toad, a symbol of earthly decay. magical neutrality, and perhaps unfairly, the scapegoat for every rash and boil from Brittany to Bavaria. And here comes tonight's eccentric little footnote. Some medieval people believed that toads could also warn of disease. If you left a toad in a shallow bowl near the hearth, and it suddenly jumped or twitched, it meant illness was coming. The logic was that toads were sensitive to unbalanced airs or poisonous humors. Or maybe they were just reacting to someone making stew too close to their bowl. It's hard to say. In some parts of Germany, there's even a record of using toad lard. Yes, that's a phrase to treat open wounds. You'd boil the toad, pause for shudder, skim off the fat, and apply it to the skin, believing it would seal the wound and draw out corruption. One 14th century source recommends mixing the fat with crushed marigold and beeswax, turning the recipe into something suspiciously close to a medieval version of lip balm. With extra nightmare fuel, let's take a breath. Imagine the stream again, the boy's hand, the woman's shawls, the toad who has seen far too much. The treatment ends not with a flourish, but with a nod. The toad is placed back into a wicker basket. The wart remains, but the boy's imagination has been thoroughly distracted. Maybe that's half the point. After all, when you lack penicillin drama and ritual become powerful placebos. Now here's your scholarly debate for the evening. Some researchers argue that medieval people knew these cures didn't work, at least not consistently, but used them anyway as part of social cohesion. Performing a ritual together built community. Others argue that belief was genuine, passed down without question, rooted in deep traditions of sympathetic magic. Both views hold merit, and both probably overlook the toad's perspective entirely. As the sun dips behind the hills, casting long amber rays across the stream, you spot another villager approaching with a limp and a hopeful expression. The healer sighs, reaches again for her basket, and mutters something about how they never run out of warts, do they? No, they don't, but they do run out of toads. One final oddity. Before you snooze, in some areas toads were considered more potent if caught under a full moon, preferably while they were croaking, in a north-facing pond, on a Tuesday, because if you're going to rub a toad on your face, you might as well be specific about it. The bubonic balm recipe. You're leaning over a wooden table in the back of a smoky, dimly lit room that smells like beeswax vinegar and something faintly amphibian. Candles flicker. A quill scratches. A heavy book lies open to a page so stained it's hard to tell what's ink and what's experience. Tonight's recipe, balm for the plague. You're not sure whether you should be impressed or horrified, especially when the first line reads, "Take one toad dried in the sun, then roast it over hot embers until its bones crack like old breadsticks." You might want to skip dinner. Tonight's historical fact: during outbreaks of the bubonic plague in the 14th century, especially the infamous Black Death toads were used in various medical treatments believed to draw out the poison of the disease. This wasn't some minor village rumor. These methods were written, copied, and passed from apothecary to apothecary. If you had a boil, or bubo, the swollen lymph node symptom that gave the plague its nickname, someone might recommend a poultice made with pulverized toad. Or in one particularly dramatic case, a live toad split down the middle and strapped to the bubo like a grotesque, moist bandage. You close the book. You reopen it. Sadly, it still says what you thought it said. According to the theory of the time diseases, like the plague, were caused by a buildup of toxic humors in the body, especially heat and black bile. The toad, being cold and wet by nature and personality, was thought to absorb those excesses. If the toad died in the process, which it always did, it was proof the cure had worked. If the patient died too, well, the toad tried. In one case, recorded in 1350, a French herbalist wrote of combining roasted toad with rosemary rue and red wine. The paste was to be applied to the patient's armpits and groin classic plague zones, and then covered with linen that had been breathed upon by a fasting virgin. Because naturally, that was the secret ingredient. You really start to wonder how the toad felt about all this. Now, for a fun wrinkle, some apothecaries preferred their toads raw, but repentant meaning caught alive and kept in a box for 3 days to purge their evil vapors. Others insisted on exorcising the toad before use, involving a brief prayer, a sprinkle of holy water, and sometimes a small bell. One wonders how you ring a bell solemnly while holding a squirming toad. But of course, these weren't the only bizarre ingredients in plague medicine. Toads had strong competition from crushed emerald powdered unicorn horn spoiler. It was just narwhal tusk and the ashes of burned silk. But toads were affordable, widely available, and bless them always conveniently shaped for grinding. The weirdest side note of the night: a few recipes called for burning the toad, whole collecting the ash, then mixing it with mother's milk and goose grease. This balm was rubbed on the feet supposedly to draw the plague downward and out through the soles. So if you've ever had a foot cream that smelled a little funky, count your blessings, it could have been worse. Some historians argue that these recipes, despite sounding absurd to modern ears, were acts of desperation rather than superstition. When death was everywhere, ringing bells, black robes, carts full of bring out your dead people clung to any method that offered hope, even if it came from a muddy pond. And here's your quiet academic debate for tonight. Did these toad balms ever work? Of course, modern medicine says no, but a few scholars suggest that some benefit might have come from the antiseptic properties of the herbs used in the mixtures, or even the placebo effect of belief itself. After all, if you truly think the toad is fighting for your life, maybe your immune system gets a bit of a pep talk. Still, it's hard to get past the visual. A patient lying feverish in a bed, their skin blotched, their breath shallow, while someone carefully places a still warm toad poultice on their chest and whispers, "Now we wait." And wait they did. For days, weeks. The toad would be replaced again and again, always with solemnity, and probably with a clothespin on the apothecary's nose. Some recipes even advised burying the used toad far from home, as its body now held the sickness. Toad cemeteries, not uncommon. One field in Sussex was reportedly known as Dead Toad Hollow, well into the 16th century. The frogs in the next pond over probably held regular vigils. Oh, and one final nibble of knowledge before your eyelids give in: some toad-based plague cures were also marketed as love potions, under the theory that surviving a brush with death made you more romantically magnetic. We're not saying it worked. We're just saying someone tried. So, if tonight you dream of old books flickering candles and toads being taken far more seriously than they ever asked to be, know that in the face of fear, people have always reached for the weirdest answers. And often, they did it with very bad aim. Toad versus frog, the healer debate. You're seated on a lopsided bench in the back corner of a smoky tavern, trying not to inhale too deeply because the air smells like turnip stew, damp wool, and very heated academic tension. Two men are standing near the hearth. One has a dried frog pinned to his belt like a badge of honor. The other holds a small toad in a linen pouch and is waving it like it's Exhibit A in a trial that only he is qualified to preside over. Welcome to one of the strangest debates of the medieval world, toad versus frog. Which one heals better? And yes, they are serious. Tonight's historical fact: while modern biology groups, frogs and toads, closely medieval healers, often made firm and sometimes fiery distinctions. Frogs were seen as more watery and connected with fevers, while toads, being earthier, were linked to plague cures, swellings, and even protection from witchcraft. Entire treatments were built around which of these bumpy creatures you happen to favor. The man with the frog leans in and says, "Everyone knows the frog's skin cools the blood. You press it to the forehead, and the fever surrenders like a Norman in a thunderstorm." The man with the toad scoffs, "Fevers, please. You've got a sniffle cure at best." The toad draws out corruption, deep corruption. This little creature has stared into the abyss and licked it. You sip whatever's in your mug and try not to take sides too early. Let's break it down. Frogs, being sleek-slick and more commonly found in cleaner water, were associated with fluidity and purification. Some medieval physicians recommended placing a live frog in the patient's mouth to cure thrush. Yes, in the mouth. No, it didn't go well. The logic was that the frog would draw out the white patches, sort of a medieval suction therapy, if you're feeling generous. Toads, on the other hand, were considered tougher, more mysterious, and certainly more sinister. They were drier, lumpier, and reportedly survived in harsher conditions. That made them ideal for treating long-term illnesses or poisoned body systems. People would dry a toad, grind it to powder, and store it in little cloth pouches ready to sprinkle into wine or rub into wounds. The taste. Let's say people weren't using it to season soup. But here's the kicker. Some healers didn't choose sides at all. They used both. There's a manuscript from 1432 that recommends boiling a frog and a toad together, adding thyme and ox bile, and applying the mix to infected limbs. Equal opportunity healing, or double the regret, hard to say. And tonight's eccentric twist. In some regions of France and Italy, toads were associated with male patients, frogs with female ones. Why? Possibly because frogs were considered more graceful and melodious, while toads were stronger and well less charming. This gendered approach to medicine didn't help the animals, but it did lead to some very awkward encounters, like a man refusing frog paste because it would weaken his humors. As the tavern debate continues, the man with the frog pulls out a scroll. It's an excerpt from Physica, the medical text by Hildegard of Bingen, who rather surprisingly praised the healing powers of frogs, particularly in herbal mixtures. He reads aloud dramatically until the toad man interrupts to cite an anonymous Bohemian monk who once wrote, "The toad suffers so that others may live." It's unclear if the monk was a healer or just bad at poetry. Here's your gentle academic nudge of the evening. Some historians argue that these distinctions were not just based on folklore, but on observation of the creature's behavior. Frogs, more active and noisy, seemed full of life. Toads, slow and still, seemed more contemplative, like little monks in muddy robes. Their natures were thought to influence how they interacted with human illness, but other scholars say more bluntly that these were simply the only small animals people could reliably catch. And when you have no antibiotics, amphibians become plan A through Z. Now the argument at the hearth grows more animated. The frogman claims his remedy cured his cousin's sweating sickness in 3 days. The toad man insists his paste cured a woman of face boils so large they had names. Someone offers to test both cures by getting intentionally sick. That offer is quickly withdrawn. You, being neutral and moderately sane, back away slowly toward the door. One last delightful detail. There are reports of medieval fairs holding frog versus toad contests where spectators bet on which creature would survive longer under the healer's trials. No, we don't know what the trials were. Yes, it was probably as weird as it sounds. A mixture of medicine and sport that no one asked for. So, which wins, the frog or the toad? Depends on who you ask, or which manuscript you're reading, or how desperate your village is. Either way, the poor creatures were both deeply overqualified and spectacularly unprepared for the role of emergency medieval doctor. Oh, and fun fact, before you float off to sleep in some medieval bestiaries, frogs and toads were labeled beasts of contradiction, harmless and healing, yet full of hidden danger. Just like medieval advice in general, sweet dreams. Try not to dream of amphibians. A toad under the bed. You're settling into a creaky straw mattress in a cottage that smells faintly of rosemary, damp linen, and something earthy. Your feet are wrapped in wool. Your candle flickers like it's second-guessing itself, and you're just about to pull the blanket over your shoulders when you hear it croak. You freeze. It's not the wind. It's not the floorboards. It's not your imagination, though that one's still up for debate. Croak. You slowly lean over the side of the bed and lift the edge of the blanket. Underneath, sitting as if it pays rent, is a plump, warty toad. Not alarmed, not nervous, just very present. Don't be alarmed. It's not here by accident. It's here on purpose. Tonight's historical fact: in some medieval households, placing a live toad under the bed or under the pillow was considered a legitimate cure for serious illness, especially when it came to fever, swelling, and those lingering night diseases that refused to leave no matter how much garlic you rubbed on your chest. The idea was simple, in the way only medieval medical logic can be. The toad would draw the illness out of your body while you slept. You'd wake up healthier. The toad might not wake up at all. This wasn't a secret practice. It was part of documented folk medicine in various regions from the English countryside to remote parts of Germany. Some versions of the cure called for the toad to be placed in a small wooden box tucked beneath the bed. Others straight on the mattress, under the sheets, like a tiny bumpy roommate. And if you're wondering whether anyone ever asked the toad's opinion, no. Consent wasn't really a medical concept in the 14th century. For humans or amphibians. You're probably wondering, did it work? Well, that depends on what you mean by work. There are scattered reports of people recovering and crediting the toad entirely. One French account even describes a woman with terrible joint pain who slept with a toad for 7 nights and claimed her bones felt as light as feathers afterward. Of course, her neighbors also said she started talking to cabbages, so your mileage may vary. Now here's the quirky detail: some believed you had to whisper your illness to the toad before placing it under the bed. Literally, confess your symptoms. I have a fever, or my throat burns, or I saw a ghost and now I can't stop sneezing. Only then would the toad know what to absorb. There was even a superstition that the toad would change color as it absorbed your sickness. If it turned pale or dark, it had worked. If it croaked repeatedly, it meant the disease was stubborn. If it escaped well, then you were cursed, and should probably leave town. Tonight's scholarly disagreement is a gentle one. Was this practice purely symbolic? Or was it connected to earlier, deeper traditions of animal transference magic? The idea that creatures could act as vessels for human suffering. Some argue it's the last gasp of ancient animist beliefs. Others say it's just what happens when people don't have Tylenol and are extremely tired. Either way, you can't deny the comfort in the ritual. You're sick. You whisper your pain. You tuck it under the bed with a creature that doesn't judge. Then you sleep. You peek again under your own bed. The toad hasn't moved. It's watching you with the calm confidence of a very old therapist. You lie back, thinking about all the things people used to do to feel a little better. From sage smoke to goose grease, from chanting monks to toad bunkmates. Medicine was as much about ritual and belief as it was about herbs and minerals. And sometimes, just having something, anything under your bed, to fight the bad stuff while you slept, that was medicine enough. Oh, and fun fact, before your brain floats off into dreamland, in one rural Italian village, there was a tradition of naming the toad under the bed. It was usually something simple, Pietro Luna, or Father Croak. Naming it was thought to bond the illness to the creature more securely. The weirder the name, the more effective the cure. So tonight, if you feel a little sniffle, don't panic. Just whisper it softly under your breath and imagine a lumpy little hero absorbing it for you with stoic silence and a squishy soul. Good night, Pietro. You're doing amazing, sweetie. The toad amulet craze. You're strolling through a bustling medieval marketplace, dodging baskets of turnips, sidestepping a goose with serious attitude, and weaving between stalls that smell of cinnamon sweat and that persistent, what is that sensation you've learned not to question. You pass a booth draped in purple velvet, clearly trying too hard, and stop when something catches your eye, a small pendant, crudely carved bone hanging from a leather cord. Next to it, a wooden sign reads, in shaky Latin, amuletum buffonis, protection guaranteed. And you think, wait, is that toad bone? Yes, it is. Tonight's historical fact, during the later Middle Ages, it became surprisingly common to wear toad parts as protective amulets, especially against fevers, poisoning, and the ever-popular evil airs. Whether it was a toe bone, a dried tongue, or in one unsettling case, an entire miniature toad mummified and worn in a pouch, the idea was the same. The toad absorbs danger, so you don't have to. People wore them around their necks, tied them to their belts, tucked them into boots, or sewed them into the hems of garments. A sort of medieval version of safety pins, if your safety pin squelched and came from a bog. The belief likely stems from the idea that the toad, being naturally poisonous, or at least suspicious looking, had the power to counteract other poisons or misfortunes. Like fights fire with fire, except it's misery with amphibian. And here's tonight's eccentric twist. There was an especially popular charm known as the toadstone, believed to be a precious gem found inside a living toad's head. Allegedly, you had to catch a toad alive, place it on a cloth in a cage, and wait for the stone to drop from its skull. Sounds convenient. The problem, no one ever actually found one. That didn't stop anyone. People still claim to own toadstones, usually polished bits of fossilized fish teeth or agate, and believe they neutralize poison and protect it against illness when worn on a ring. Even royalty joined in. Some noble families proudly displayed rings set with supposed toadstones, passing them down like heirlooms. Because nothing says family legacy like a mythical skull rock from a disgruntled amphibian. But if you couldn't afford a ring, there were other options. A popular low-budget alternative, a dried toad foot strung on string. A little bouncy, slightly grim, but very fashionable for the apocalyptic plague look of the 14th century. Children sometimes wore small toad bones sewn into their clothes to keep the fevers away. Presumably, the bones didn't protest. Now here's where things get academic. Gently, historians still debate whether these amulets were truly believed to be magical or simply symbols of hope, like how modern folks carry lucky coins or rabbit's feet. Some argue the toad bones functioned as a kind of folk placebo anchoring fear with a physical object. Others say belief was absolute, passed from grandmother to child with no questions asked, just wear it, and don't drop it in the soup. You pause at the market stall. The seller, an elderly man with a beard like a broom and breath like garlic's ghost, lifts the toad bone amulet toward you and whispers, "Keeps the fever out and the demons confused." You nod. You weren't planning to argue. Another shopper walks up and asks if he has any toad teeth. He pulls out a tiny pouch and shakes it like medieval tic-tacs. The sound is both charming and slightly horrifying. There are even records of toad parts being embedded in armor, especially during the 100 Years' War. Some knights believed having a toad bone near the heart would prevent bleeding. It didn't, but it made them feel invincible, and sometimes that's all you need before charging into chaos. In one story from the Low Countries, a merchant wore a dried toad skin in his boot for 20 years, convinced it kept away bad dreams and tax collectors. When he lost it, he claimed his sleep got worse and his taxes doubled. Correlation? Probably not. But it's hard to argue with conviction. Here's the most charming and slightly unhinged detail of the night in some villages. Toads were blessed by the local healer before being turned into amulets. A little ritual, a sprinkle of herbs, a whispered rhyme, as if saying, "Sorry for what's about to happen, but it's for the greater good." Sort of like apologizing to your Wi-Fi router before resetting it. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine wearing your own little talisman, one that doesn't buzz beep or require updates. Just a simple reminder that once upon a time, in a world full of uncertainty, people turned to the humblest, lumpiest creatures they could find and said, "Protect me." Oh, and fun fact to send you into dreamland, there was one French village that believed toad bone necklaces improved singing voices. Choir boys were sometimes given tiny bone pendants before a performance. No one knows if it helped the pitch, but it certainly made for unforgettable stage presence. Sleep well, little singer. May your dreams be free of fevers and full of frogs and necklaces. Cooked, burned, or buried, you're crouched by a medieval hearth, poking at the embers with a long iron rod that was probably once a sword, now demoted to fire-stirring duty. The air smells of old soup, damp wool, and something distinctly scorched. A pot simmers nearby, not with stew, but with something far less appetizing, the last remnants of a recently roasted toad. Don't worry, you're not expected to eat it. Tonight's historical fact: in various parts of medieval Europe, toads were not just used whole or dried. They were cooked, burned, ground, or even buried as part of medical treatments. Depending on your ailment, a toad could be fried in oil, boiled in wine, or roasted to ash and mixed into ointments. Each method came with its own logic, most of it suspiciously smoky. Why all the culinary flair? Because the method of preparation supposedly influenced the effectiveness of the cure. Boiling was for gentler ailments, like coughs, chills, or headaches. Burning, that was for plague poison and anything deemed truly sinister. Burying a toad was usually for preventative magic or for transferring illness into the earth. Imagine that you get a fever, and someone's first instinct is to dig a hole for an amphibian. In one recorded case, from 1371, a woman in Devon was treated for a swollen leg by roasting a toad until it crumbled, mixing the ash with butter and spreading it on her skin. The healer claimed this would soften the swelling and invite the poison out. The woman claimed it smelled worse than the swelling. Results inconclusive. Another example from the Compendium of Useful Remedies suggests that toad broth, yes, it's as bad as it sounds, could be used to fight internal corruption. The recipe called for a single toad, boiled alive in milk and strained through linen. The liquid was then mixed with crushed sage honey and a coin of silver for luck. Whether it helped is debatable. Whether it traumatized people at the dinner table is not. You might be wondering, why cook the toad at all? Why not just use it as is? Well, that brings us to a favorite medieval medical concept: transmutation through fire. The idea was that burning something purified, it released its hidden powers or transformed it into its most useful state. In the case of toads, that state was apparently ashy and emotionally disturbing. Sometimes, the cooking was symbolic. One folk remedy claimed that if you burned a toad on the first day of spring, collected its bones, and wore one under your tongue, you could see the truth in dreams. Another version said the same method let you speak with animals. Probably not toads, for obvious reasons. Here's your odd historical footnote. For the night, in some households, a toad was ritually buried in the garden as a ward against crop rot. The belief was that the toad's body, as it decayed, would absorb and neutralize the bad spirits or miasmas that caused withering plants. A sort of amphibian scarecrow, but underground. And now, your scholarly disagreement. Some researchers believe that these practices, especially burning and burying, were rooted in older pagan traditions later woven into folk medicine. The toad, symbolically associated with earth decay and cycles of transformation, was seen as a kind of bridge between health and death. Others argue that these methods were driven by plain trial and error. If a roasted toad paste worked once by coincidence or placebo, it was enough for the rumor to spread. The atmosphere around the fire grows thick. You glance into the pot again. Inside is a dark, viscous paste with floating bits that may once have had a face. The apothecary ladles it out into a wooden bowl, muttering something about cleansing the humors and facing the darkness. You suddenly miss plain old leeches. There's a certain ritualistic solemnity to the whole process. The toad, once hopping merrily by a pond, has been transformed through heat and hope into someone's last chance. It's almost spiritual. Almost. And yet not all preparations involved violence. Some healers simply dried the toad whole and placed it under pillows or hung it in doorways. Others encouraged the toad to excrete its poison into water or wine, which was then diluted and used topically. It's unclear how many toads willingly cooperated in this scientific endeavor. And just when you think it can't get weirder in parts of Eastern Europe, there's a 15th century record of a ceremonial toad burning conducted at the edge of town to ward off an oncoming plague. Villagers gathered, sang hymns, and watched as a dried toad was set ablaze on a bed of rosemary and ash wood. Was it a healing act, a purification rite, or just something to do on a Thursday? You'll never know for sure. But you suspect the toad didn't volunteer. One final fun fact. for your sleepy brain. In some traditions, the ashes of a burned toad were sprinkled on the thresholds of sick rooms to protect others from catching the illness. A dusty, dramatic gesture that likely accomplished little, but maybe helped people feel like they were doing something. Which, in the absence of real cures, is its own kind of healing. So tonight, if your dreams smell faintly of rosemary and roasted regrets, know that somewhere in the foggy archives of history, someone once believed that a scorched toad could keep death at bay. And maybe, just maybe, it did for a little while. The church's mixed feelings. You're sitting in the back pew of a small medieval chapel, the kind where the candles drip more wax than light, and the ceiling smells like damp stone and centuries of whispered apologies. The sermon is winding down, and the priest is speaking in tones so soft you could almost fall asleep if not for the subject of today's lesson. Not sin, not salvation, but toads. Your ears perk up. The priest points to a carving above the altar. There, just barely illuminated, is a stone creature with bulging eyes and splayed toes carved into the edge of an arch. It's unmistakably a toad. The congregation shifts uncomfortably. Tonight's historical fact: in medieval Europe, the church had a complicated relationship with toads. They were sometimes symbols of evil filth and temptation, but also paradoxically tools of healing and protection in folk practices. This created a tension between official doctrine and local belief that played out in sermons, sculptures, and occasionally interrogations. Let's start with the darker view. Toads, in the Christian imagination of the time, were often associated with sin. They lived in mud, made strange noises, and had warty, ugly appearances, qualities that medieval symbolism linked with lust, greed, or decay. In some illuminated manuscripts, the damned are shown in hell, being licked, devoured, or tormented by enormous toads. One scribe even annotated the margins of his Bible with a doodle of a toad squatting triumphantly on a gold coin vanitas in a nutshell. And then there were the witch trials. In many inquisitorial records, toads appear as familiars, creatures believed to serve witches, helping them cast spells or perform dark rites. Some accused women were said to have hidden toads in their skirts, or fed them drops of blood in exchange for power. It didn't help that toads sometimes had colorful, strange markings on their skin, which inquisitors claimed were satanic sigils or freckles. Hard to say, but, and here's the twist, that wasn't the whole story. In rural areas, especially among peasant communities, toads remained deeply embedded in healing traditions, many of which had been around since long before Christianity reached their villages. Even some monks, especially those trained in herbal medicine, quietly included toad-based remedies in their work. There's a 12th century record of a Benedictine scriptorium keeping a jar labeled Buffonum pulvis toad powder on the shelf beside dried lavender and licorice root. One friar, in a marginal note, even wrote, "For boils, the dried skin of a toad does lessen the swelling, though one should not mention this in sermons." The church itself never made a unified decision about toads. While some theologians warned against their use, calling them unclean and spiritually dangerous, others seemed indifferent. In one curious case, a village priest in the Rhineland reportedly blessed a toad brought by a grieving mother, asking God to use the creature to draw the fever from her child. The child recovered. The priest later claimed the blessing was purely symbolic. The toad offered no comment. This duality shows up in medieval art too. In cathedrals and chapels, toads are sometimes found carved into the corners of religious scenes, but not always as villains. One cathedral in Normandy has a toad nestled next to a carving of St. Luke. Why? Possibly to represent healing. Possibly to eat bugs. Possibly because the stonemason just liked the shape. Here's tonight's scholarly whisper. Historians debate whether the church's fear of toads was top-down, driven by clergy and theologians, or bottom-up, shaped by local rumors and popular imagination. Some argue that the church tolerated small-scale folk practices like healing with toad charms, so long as no one claimed miraculous powers. Others point to church decrees banning the use of toads in medicine outright. The truth, as always in history, is murky and full of legs. Back in the pew, you glance again at the stone carving above the altar. The toad seems to be smiling, or maybe smirking. Either way, it's not going anywhere. And perhaps that was the church's real issue, not that the toad was evil, but that it refused to fit neatly into the categories of good or bad. It could heal or harm. It could live in the mud, yet inspire hope. In a worldview obsessed with absolutes, the toad was dangerously ambiguous. Oh, and a gentle absurdity to end your night in some monastic orders. Novices were warned not to touch toads during fasting seasons, as they were believed to stir carnal thoughts. No one ever explained how or why, but the idea of a toad being considered seductive is definitely a historical highlight. So tonight, if your dreams include a chapel, a candle, and a toad sitting judgmentally on a pew, don't be alarmed. It's just history reminding you that even the humblest creatures can stir deep questions and occasionally make priests very nervous. When toads wore robes, you're peering into a modest thatched hut nestled on the edge of a medieval village where the herbalist's home doubles as her apothecary, her office, and possibly her goat's winter bedroom. On the table sits a small, squat, slightly damp toad, cloaked in what appears to be a tiny linen vest tied at the front with delicate string. You stare. The toad stares back. Neither of you blink. Congratulations! You've just encountered one of medieval medicine's strangest customs, dressing the toad. Tonight's historical fact: in certain parts of Europe, particularly in English and German folk traditions, healers dress toads in bits of cloth before using them in rituals or cures. These weren't elaborate outfits, mind you. We're talking about tiny hoods, miniature tunics, or simple linen wrappings. The goal wasn't fashion, although honestly, they pulled it off. It was symbolic preparation. You might be wondering, why dress a toad? Isn't it already uncomfortable enough being handed over to a medieval apothecary? Well, the logic went something like this. Illness is dangerous, yes, but also mysterious. And if the toad is to absorb that danger, it must be protected, or at least consecrated. Wrapping the toad in fabric was often considered a spiritual act. The cloth might have been blessed, embroidered with a cross, or soaked in herbal tinctures. Once robed, the toad was ready to carry illness away, or at least keep it from escaping too early. Some practitioners believed that the wrapping helped contain the sickness once it entered the toad's body. Others thought it prevented the toad from leaking bad humors into the room. Either way, there it sat, a bundled amphibian, quiet and tragically dignified, like a very small monk on his last mission. The fashion didn't stop there. In some 14th century healing manuscripts, there are instructions for color coding the toad's outfit depending on the illness. Red for fevers, blue for melancholy, green, ironically, for stomach ailments. One source, written in shaky Latin, suggests a patient stitch the cloth themselves while reciting a psalm because apparently nothing says healing like spiritually infused haberdashery. There's even a documented case where a healer in Bohemia insisted on trimming the toad's robe with thread made from the patient's hair. This, she claimed, would help the creature tune itself to the sick person's spirit. You decide not to ask what she meant by tune, or spirit, or honestly trim. Here's your delightful oddity of the night. In one rural Austrian village, children believed that if you gave a toad a tiny scarf and let it go, it would take your bad dreams away. It had to be red wool. It had to be tied in a bow. And you had to say thank you. Otherwise, the toad might come back with more dreams. Toad etiquette apparently was very specific, but not everyone appreciated the look. Some church authorities frowned upon this practice, worrying that dressing beasts for ritual smacked of pagan rites. And perhaps they were right. There are echoes of older traditions here, where animals were cloaked before sacrifice or honored before release. But for the villagers who did it, the act wasn't sacrilege. It was a form of reverence. That brings us to tonight's academic friction. Historians can't quite agree whether this was literal, ritual magic, symbolic medicine, or just comfort theater. Was the wrapping meant to bind spirits, protect the user, calm the toad, or did it simply make people feel like they were doing something meaningful in a time when meaning was hard to come by? Whatever the reason, the image endures. You imagine a woman in a drafty cottage cradling a toad in a scrap of cloth. Her child burns with fever in the next room. She's done everything else herbs prayer cool water. Now she wraps the toad and places it gently beneath the bed. It's strange. It's quiet. It's hope. And while no toad would ever request a robe, few ever complained. They simply sat, blinked, and waited for whatever odd assignment came next. Oh, and a tiny touch of whimsy to lull you into dreamland, there's a marginal drawing in a 15th century English herbal manual that shows a toad wearing a pointed cap and holding a spoon. No explanation, no caption, just a well-dressed toad ready for dinner, or battle, or story time. We may never know. So, if you dream tonight of a toad in a tunic marching bravely through your worries with a linen sash fluttering in the wind, let it. History is weird. Medicine is weirder. And sometimes, healing just looks like a very small night with a damp stare. Sleep well, brave tailor. The toads have your back. The village toad whisperer. You're walking through mist-soaked fields at dawn, the grass cold against your boots, your breath puffing in little clouds. There's a smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and something just a bit herbal. Ahead, an odd figure crouches beside a shallow pond. Long cloak, pulled close, one hand extended. They aren't fishing. They aren't praying. They're whistling. Not a cheerful tune. Not a song you recognize. It's soft, low, and strangely rhythmic, like wind brushing through reeds. And they're emerging from the reeds with the slow inevitability of awkward royalty is a very large toad. Meet the local toad whisperer. Tonight's historical fact: in certain parts of medieval Europe, especially in small rural communities, there were individuals known for their ability to call toads for healing rituals. They weren't official apothecaries or monks, just everyday people with reputations for being touched or in tune, depending on who you asked. Their methods unclear, their results dubious, their confidence unshakable. Most villages had at least one, the person you went to when nothing else worked. When you'd tried garlic nettles, St. John's wort, leeches, and prayer, and still couldn't shake that fever or swelling, someone would eventually whisper, "Go see old Mella," or "Find Tom behind the mill pond." That's where the toads were, and that's where the whisperers waited. You approach quietly. The figure doesn't turn, but speaks. Don't spook it. You freeze. The toad has stopped mid-hop, one leg in the air, like a statue of awkwardness. Slowly, it continues toward a square of cloth on the ground, a familiar sight by now. It's laced with something sticky. Rue, maybe? Crushed sage. Whatever it is, the toad clearly smells it before you do. The whisperer produces a small wooden box. For the lungs, they murmur. They're going to collect mucus. You decide not to ask questions. According to folk belief, certain toads were better than others. Not all whisperers agreed on which. Some swore by the black-spotted marsh toad. Others preferred the flatter green ones that lived near stone ruins. The idea was that the environment shaped the creature's power. A toad born in holy ground absorbed purity, won from a graveyard curse-lifting power. There were rituals, of course, not just whistling. Some whisperers hummed into bowls of water. Others spoke the name of the illness out loud, believing the toad could recognize the sickness and know what to do with it. One particularly eccentric method involved showing the toad a drawing of the patient's face. It's unclear how the toad rated the likeness. Here's your wonderfully weird detail of the night. In some villages, toads were given names and spoken to as if they were colleagues. Whisperers believed the toad had to agree to help. One record from 1448 mentions a healer who kept a toad named Bertolo in a carved walnut shell lined with fleece. "He only works if you ask nicely," she was known to say. And if it's a waxing moon, academic debates on this are delightful. Some scholars suggest toad whispering may have been an early form of animal-assisted therapy, albeit more moist. Others see it as ritualized performance, a psychological theater for people in despair. Either way, the patient's often left feeling lighter, not necessarily cured, but hopeful. The whisperer before you lifts the toad gently and places it in a bowl lined with herbs. The toad doesn't resist. This part of the ritual is called holding the burden. Supposedly, as the toad sat among the healing plants, it would begin to draw the sickness from whoever touched the bowl. Some rituals required the patient to breathe over it. Others, to place their hand on the toad's back. You wonder if the toad ever resented this. Of course it didn't always work. Nothing always does. But failure didn't seem to diminish the toad's reputation. If someone didn't heal, the explanation was usually, it was too late, or the stars weren't right, or that wasn't Bertolot's specialty. And yes, sometimes the toad died during the process. When that happened, it was believed the toad had taken the illness completely into itself, a sacrifice. The patient was instructed to bury the body near running water, offer a prayer, and never look back. Which frankly is good advice in most cases involving amphibian funerals. You watch as the whisperer wraps the toad in a soft square of cloth. Not for cooking, not for a charm, just rest. They nod at you, and you sense the session is over. The toad has done its work, or maybe it hasn't. But either way, it's had a long day. Oh, and your little sleepy bonus fact: in one Welsh village, there was a belief that if a toad blinked 3 times while facing you, your sickness would pass within a week. But if it yawned, you had a month at best. Villagers kept close watch. So, tonight, if your dreams include a toad with a tiny name tag and a soothing voice guiding you through a forest of nettles and healing herbs, don't resist. Just follow, and maybe hum a little tune along the way, because you never know who or what is listening. Toad in a bottle traveling medicine. You're standing in the middle of a medieval town square, boots coated in dust nostrils, full of roasted onion and sheep, when a loud bell clangs 3 times. A man steps onto an upturned crate, his coat flapping like it hasn't been washed since the last plague. He raises a bottle above his head, a cloudy, thick-glassed flask half filled with something yellow-green and suspiciously lumpy. "Step forward, good people," he calls. "I bring thee health strength and the finest toad elixir this side of the river Avon." A child whispers to his mother, "Is the toad alive in there?" The mother shushes him and eyes the bottle warily. Welcome to the curious world of toad-in-a-bottle medicine, where desperation met entrepreneurship, and someone was always willing to sell you a miracle, even if it blinked. Tonight's historical fact: in late medieval and early Renaissance Europe, traveling medicine sellers began offering bottled toad-based remedies, tinctures, oils, spirits, and powders suspended in alcohol vinegar or mystery broth. These concoctions claim to cure everything from fevers to fainting spells, from pox to lovesickness. The ingredients. Often a closely guarded secret, but everyone sort of knew. Yes, there was toad in there. Some sellers insisted on displaying a whole preserved toad in the bottle, bobbing gently like a saint in amber. It wasn't always the active ingredient. Sometimes it was more of a visual brand, a soggy mascot that screamed, "This potion means business." Other bottles were more discreet, labeled with alchemical symbols or vague Latin phrases, and occasionally adorned with drawings of leaping amphibians in heroic poses. One particularly ambitious peddler in Prague offered a line of remedies called Salvus Buffonum, claiming each batch had been blessed by a hermit who'd spoken with the spirits of frogs. No one asked for credentials. The base liquid varied wildly. Cheap versions used rainwater and crushed garlic. Fancy ones marketed to wealthier clients used wine honey or distilled herbs. The most expensive infused with sun-dried toad marrow and sold in bottles sealed with red wax and tiny brass toad figurines. A bit much, but hey, branding. Here's the delightful detail of the evening. Some bottles were designed with a small bell inside, intended to ring faintly when shaken. The sound was said to wake the medicine or startle the sickness. Others claimed the bell scared off demons, or at least gave the customer something distracting to listen to while nothing improved. Traveling sellers knew their crowd. They offered not just medicine, but performance. They told stories. Each bottle came with a tale of a child saved from death, a noble cured of madness, a donkey that stopped sneezing. They shouted these stories from carts, from stages, even from the backs of donkeys. The donkeys were not consulted. Naturally, not all of it was honest. Some sellers used no toad at all, just cloudy wine and bits of leather. But others were true believers, or at least raised by them. One woman in Flanders was famous for her toad tonic Tuesdays, when she set up shop beside the cathedral steps and claimed she could pull the poison from the people for a single coin and a compliment. And here's your academic flicker. For the night, some historians argue that these sellers were not mere charlatans, but cultural translators taking old village remedies and adapting them into portable commercial formats. They turned ritual into product-weaving folk beliefs into urban life. Others say, with less generosity, that it was the beginning of medieval snake oil. The snake in this case just had warts. You're handed a bottle to examine. It's warm, slightly sticky. The liquid sloshes reluctantly. Inside, suspended like a relic, is a clearly visible toad, eyes closed, legs curled, as if sleeping off the worst business trip of its life. Good for chills shakes and ungrateful children, the seller promises. Also, boosts charm. You raise an eyebrow. Not your charm. The bottles. You hand it back politely. Of course there were rules. In some cities, guilds tried to regulate the sale of such elixirs. In others, church officials banned toad-based cures altogether, calling them unclean practices. But like mold in a monastery, the practice persisted, especially in plague years, especially when the usual remedies had failed, because in those desperate moments, even a squishy bottle with a floating toad inside seemed like hope. Messy, mysterious, vaguely smelly hope. And now, your final quirk for tonight in one Bavarian town. Customers were advised to sleep with the bottle under the left armpit for full effect. The warmth of the body was said to activate the spirit of the toad. You wonder how many people rolled over in their sleep and woke up to a very unpleasant surprise. So, as you drift into rest, imagine the clinking of bottles, the ring of a tiny bell, and a man shouting stories into the dusk, promising that inside this cloudy flask is something just wild enough to work, or at least wild enough to believe in. Medical manuscripts and marginalia. You're tucked into the corner of a medieval scriptorium, where the air smells like ink candle wax and a monk's quiet despair. Around you, manuscripts pile high, some on shelves, some on desks, and a few balancing precariously on a sleepy cat. It's the kind of place where knowledge is copied slowly, reverently, and occasionally with a flair for the bizarre. You crack open a thick, leather-bound volume labeled Liber de Herbis, et Bestiis book of herbs and beasts. Its parchment pages are yellowed, the script tight and spidery. And right there in the margin, beside a list of fever remedies, is an illustration of a toad, but not just any toad. This toad is wearing a tiny gold crown, and it's flying. Tonight's historical fact in medieval medical manuscripts: toads frequently appeared not only in recipes and remedies, but in the margins too, where monks and scribes left strange little drawings known as marginalia. Some of these images serve to illustrate the text, others not so much. In theory, these manuscripts were serious business. Many were meant to preserve medical knowledge, how to treat fevers, swelling headaches, and other maladies. Toads were listed among the ingredients, especially in sections dealing with pestilence or skin conditions. Some recipes were as precise as modern prescriptions. Others included lines like, apply when the moon is in Virgo and the toad is compliant. But then, around the edges, the real fun began. Here's a little-known truth medieval scribes got bored. Copying the same words hour after hour, day after day, was grueling work. And boredom is fertile soil for whimsy. That's why, in the same manuscript that solemnly recommends powdered toad for stomach cramps, you might also find a doodle of a toad jousting with a snail, or a choir of frogs singing from a tiny hymn book. Some marginalia were symbolic. A toad near the word pestilentia might represent the disease itself. A crushed toad beneath a human foot triumph over illness. But more often than not, the meanings are murky. One folio shows a toad sitting in a tub with a crown and scepter being fanned by insects. No explanation, no footnote, just a very pampered amphibian. You flip through another manuscript, this one, from a monastic infirmary in Burgundy, and discover a recipe titled Unguentum contra mortem, ointment against death. It includes, among other things, ashes of burned toad, oil of sage, and the breath of a fasting boy. In the corner of the page, someone has drawn a toad holding its own nose. It's unclear if this was meant as medical criticism or personal protest. Now, not all the drawings were jokes. In some cases, the illustrations were genuine attempts at anatomical diagrams. Toads were drawn in profile, dissected, labeled with unfamiliar Latin that may or may not mean spleen. Some artists tried to capture their texture. Others gave up and just drew them as round blobs with googly eyes. Here's your scholarly debate of the evening. Did these marginalia influence the way people saw toads in medicine, or were they reflections of already existing beliefs? Some historians argue that the whimsical drawings reinforced the toad's image as a magical, slightly ridiculous creature. Others believe the marginalia came from a place of reverence and curiosity, tinged with mischief, but grounded in belief. You pause over a particularly odd page. It's from an English bestiary, but instead of a typical animal entry, there's a toad in bed being visited by monks. One is offering it tea. Another is crying. The caption reads, Hoc est buffonis infirmi. This is the sick toad. You close the book slowly. Monks, it seems, had a sense of humor. And here's tonight's charming absurdity in a manuscript from northern Italy. There's a recipe for toad-based ink. Supposedly, burning a dried toad and mixing its ashes with oak gall and wine would produce ink that lasts forever and displeases demons. The formula is sandwiched between a cure for gout and a list of banned cheeses. Priorities were fluid. There's even a record of talking toads in manuscript margins, where a conversation is written between a toad and a fly. The toad claims to be a doctor. The fly asks for a prescription. The scribe, perhaps a bit punchy from lack of sleep, has them arguing about dosage. You begin to realize that these books, despite their age, feel oddly alive, not just because of the knowledge they contain, but because of the human fingerprints left all over them. Not literal ones, though those exist too, but the jokes, the doodles, the mistakes lovingly scratched out and rewritten. Medicine in the Middle Ages wasn't just practical, it was theatrical, emotional, sometimes absurd. And the toad, that humble creature of mud and myths, was both subject and symbol. Oh, and your fun dream fact, for tonight in one Parisian manuscript, there's a full-page miniature of a toad lecturing to a class of lizards. They sit on little stools. One lizard is asleep. Another is taking notes. The toad wears glasses. Again, no context. Just the comfortable certainty that someone somewhere found that image necessary. So as you drift off, picture this, an ancient library, quiet and candlelit, where knowledge hops and sings in the margins. And somewhere, in one forgotten folio, a toad in a robe smiles back. He knows something. He always does. Royal remedies gone awry. You're walking through the echoing corridors of a medieval palace, where the walls are hung with tapestries of saints' lions and the occasional suspiciously plump unicorn. The air smells like lavender-polished brass and a faint trace of boiled meat. You're not a noble, not a servant. You're simply visiting, perhaps as an observer, perhaps as a time-traveling guest. Either way, you find yourself in the royal infirmary. And what do you see? A velvet cushion, a golden goblet, and next to both a silver dish containing one very unfortunate toad. Tonight's historical fact, even royalty wasn't spared from the medieval obsession with toad-based cures. From kings battling fevers to princesses plagued by strange rashes, toads were used in treatments across social classes, including at court. But unlike the common folk, nobles demanded their toads come accessorized. Let's start with a tale from the 14th century Burgundian court. A young duke, age 11, reportedly delicate in constitution, came down with a mysterious swelling behind his ears. The court physicians consulted their texts, whispered to one another, and finally declared that a gently roasted toad soaked in rosewater, applied warm to the swelling, would draw out the sickness. The toad was sourced from the royal pond. The rosewater was sourced from the queen's own bath. The application was done using silk napkins by candlelight, while a harp played in the background. After all, if you're going to press a toad to your neck, you might as well do it like a prince. Unfortunately, the swelling didn't go away. The court physician was replaced. The toad was buried with honors. The harpist was promoted for emotional support. Not every royal story ends in failure, though. One popular account from England tells of a queen's handmaid recovering from fever of the womb, whatever that meant, after wearing a dried toad tied in a ribbon around her waist for 6 days. The ribbon was described as blue embroidered with golden thread, fit for a lady of the chamber. The toad presumably had no objections to the color palette. But then there are the cautionary tales. In the court of Naples, a nobleman sought to impress the king with a new invention toad elixir in crystal vials laced with saffron and crushed pearls. He claimed it prevented all illness and extended one's life by no fewer than 11 years. He was very specific about the number. The king drank it. He then vomited for 3 days, blamed the stars, and exiled the nobleman, not for the bad medicine, but for wasting perfectly good pearls. And here's your wonderfully weird aside of the evening royal astrologers sometimes advised when to use toad remedies based on planetary alignment. One calendar suggested that Mars in retrograde favors toad applications, especially when Saturn scowls. If that sounds like nonsense, you're correct. But in the medieval court, nonsense backed by charts was practically science. Here's where things get academically spicy. Some historians argue that the inclusion of toad-based remedies in royal households reflected the blending of folk medicine and elite practice. Others say the royals simply borrowed whatever worked among peasants, repackaged it with silk and Latin, and declared it innovation. Both theories are probably true. After all, the gap between peasant poultice and palace cure was often only a gold-trimmed jar away. Now let's talk about the toad physician of Prague. This curious figure, real name lost to time, was a physician who rose to favor under a minor Bohemian prince due to his success with Aqua Bufoni's toad water. Legend says he carried a live toad in a carved wooden box, at all times occasionally consulting it for diagnosis. His patients were instructed to speak into the box. If the toad croaked, that was good. If it blinked twice, very good. If it turned away, time to make a will. He eventually fell out of favor when a noblewoman accused him of letting the toad sleep in her satin shoes. Whether or not this happened, the toad was not given a chance to testify. You pass another hallway. This one leads to the royal apothecary. Rows of jars glint behind glass-dried lavender crushed coral eagle feathers, and yes, powdered toad, labeled in Latin as Buffonus exicati. For external use, only thank heavens. And now, a whimsical bonus before you sleep there is a record, just one, from a Hungarian castle, claiming that a royal falcon was once fed a tiny toad every fortnight. to maintain sharpness of eye and clarity of wing. The falcon reportedly lived longer than expected. The falconer developed a mild fear of puddles. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine a royal bedroom lit with beeswax candles, a toad sitting regally on a velvet pillow, and a physician gently fanning it while explaining dosage in very careful French. Because nothing says prestige like a creature from the swamp turned medical consultant to the crown. Sleep well, Your Grace. The toads are on duty. The black toad of Cornwall. You're standing at the edge of a windswept moor in Cornwall, where the heather rolls in purples and grays, and the sky looks like it hasn't smiled in a century. There's a chill in the air, not sharp, but patient, the kind of cold that waits. In the distance, half buried in the fog, you see a circle of standing stones, and at its center something far less expected. A statue. No, not a statue. A shrine to a toad. And not just any toad, the black toad of Cornwall, subject of murmurs, ballads, and a surprising number of medicinal recipes scrawled in very uneven handwriting. Tonight's historical fact across parts of medieval Cornwall and Devon. There existed local legends about a massive jet black toad believed to possess healing powers. Whether it was a real creature, a metaphor, or a regional mascot is still debated. What's not debated is that people left offerings spoke to it, and in some cases rubbed their sores directly on its back. Don't judge. Medieval times were a bit porous with boundaries. According to the local stories, this toad lived in a hollow beneath a sacred spring. It only emerged at twilight, and only for those whose illnesses were true, which is a polite way of saying it avoided hypochondriacs. Those lucky or desperate enough to see it would follow a ritual kneel, speak their ailment aloud, and offer something symbolic, usually a ribbon, a coin, or strangely, often a small loaf of bread. And if the toad licked the bread, congratulations, you were going to recover. If the toad ignored you, best start writing your will. Naturally, many tried to capture the toad, hoping to bottle its power, or charge a fee for private visits. One legend tells of a knight who chased it through the moor with a sack only to vanish for 3 days and return covered in moss and muttering about shadows that blinked. Whether that story's true is uncertain. What's certain is that over time, the black toad became part of local medical lore. Healers would claim they had the blessing of the toad if their remedies worked. Some carried toad-shaped talismans carved from bogwood, said to carry its essence. Others mixed ash from burned black cloth into their toad salves to replicate the energy. Yes, toad salves. You know how this works by now. One manuscript from the 15th century, found in a coastal parish, includes a recipe titled Unguentum nigrum buffonis, the black toad ointment. It required flesh of the moon-born toad blackberries gathered at dusk, and wax melted from a candle burned beside a sleeping dog. If you're confused, you're not alone. The margins include a note. Do not attempt during storms. The shrine itself, yes, there was a real one, was nothing grand. Just a mound of stones, some charred remains of past fires, and a hollow in the center just big enough for something damp to sit comfortably. Pilgrims visited it under moonlight. Some claimed to hear croaking in response to prayers. Others swore they left cured of ailments too shameful to name. You can probably guess. And here's tonight's odd little detail. A few brave villagers reportedly saw not one, but 2 toads. One, black, one, pale. If the black one came healing. If the pale one came, well, they never said. Just went quiet and started wearing garlic in their boots. This brings us to our academic dilemma. Was the black toad simply a folk invention, a creature to channel communal fears and hopes? Or did it stem from a distorted memory of ancient Celtic animal deities? Some historians link it to older druidic symbols. Others roll their eyes and point to swamp gas. As usual, the truth squats somewhere in the middle, croaking softly. But the influence was real. There are records of nobles requesting ointments blessed in the Cornish fashion, and even one bishop who commissioned a carved black toad for his personal chapel later denied any knowledge of it when questioned. He called it an allegorical paperweight. Local children were told to whisper their worries to frogs so the black toad would hear them. Farmers believed his presence protected crops from rot, and traveling merchants sometimes wore black stone toad rings so the road shall not sicken me. In time, as with all legends, the visits faded. The toad was seen less and less. The shrine grew over with moss, but the stories remained, scribbled into recipe books passed down in lullabies, and eventually hidden between pages of more respectable texts. Now, here's your bedtime amuse-bouche. In one faded Cornwall folktale, a young girl cured her family's coughing fits by placing a black pebble under her pillow and dreaming of the toad. She said he wore spectacles and had a voice like church bells. The next morning, the cough was gone. The family celebrated. The pebble was never moved again. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine that more. The mist curling low, the shrine silent and waiting, and somewhere beneath the heather, a soft movement, a ripple of ancient breath, watching, waiting, and perhaps even now, still listening. Sleep well. The black toad approves. Peasants and pond raids, you're tiptoeing through a patch of tall reeds, the moon barely peeking out from behind a sulking cloud. The air is damp thick with the scent of wet moss mildew and the unmistakable promise of regret. Somewhere to your left, a sheep coughs with theatrical timing. Somewhere to your right, someone whispers, "Careful. That one's got warts the size of raisins." Welcome to the covert world of medieval peasant pond raids, late-night excursions to collect that most elusive of pharmacy stock, the common toad. Tonight's historical fact: in many rural communities across medieval Europe, peasants regularly foraged for toads as part of their home medicine kits. Not bought, not traded. Caught, by hand, at night, preferably with a burlap sack and a whispered apology to St. Hubert, while upper-class physicians might order powdered toad by the jar or receive tinctures delivered by solemn apprentices in hats too big for their heads. Peasants went straight to the source. Why pay for what the bog provides for free? And yet it wasn't just a matter of grabbing the first amphibian you saw. Oh no. There were rules, superstitions, techniques, timing. Catching a toad was an art form, some said even a calling. You follow two such practitioners, now old Rika and her grandson Tib, armed with a lantern, a net, and a burlap bag that smells faintly of rosemary and goat. They whisper to one another as they squelch through the mud. Not that when Rika says, "Eyes are too polite." Tib nods solemnly, as if this makes sense. Toads were caught for a variety of reasons: to dry and grind for later use, to apply live in treatments, or to extract fluids and body parts for specific folk recipes. And yes, some people swore that only the third toad you saw on a Friday was effective against joint pain. Others said you needed to catch it under a waxing moon while reciting the Paternoster backward, which was hard, especially if you didn't know Latin. There's even a record of a local healer in 14th century Wales who specialized in whisper-caught toads, captured only after the would-be healer explained their illness aloud to the pond. If the toad surfaced in response, it was deemed spiritually aligned with the cure. Naturally, the church frowned on this sort of behavior. Not because of the toads per se, but because anything involving murky water, moonlight, and whispered Latin automatically set off the witchcraft alarm bells. But out in the countryside, far from bishops and rulebooks, people just did what worked, or what someone's great aunt once swore worked. Here's your wonderfully odd detail of the night. Some families kept a house toad, a single toad caught during a particularly successful raid, believed to absorb illness from the household over time. It was kept in a shoebox-sized pen, fed beetles and boiled oats, and occasionally spoken to when no one else was around. If the toad died, it was buried with a prayer and a fresh potato. No one remembers why the potato was necessary. It just was. Academic opinion varies wildly on this kind of practice. Some scholars see it as a form of practical folk medicine, grounded in observation repetition and whatever herbal backup was on hand. Others see symbolic substitution, the toad standing in as a living scapegoat for disease-absorbing harm through ancient ritual patterns. Still others just raise an eyebrow and say, "They did what?" Meanwhile, back at the pond, old Rika is crouched in her favorite spot, muttering gently to a patch of moonlit mud. Tib holds the net, trembling slightly more from anticipation than fear. A ripple, a soft plop. A squat, glistening toad heaves itself onto a flat stone, like a very damp king claiming his throne. "That's the one," Rika says, nodding. "He's got that look." You help them place the toad into a cloth-lined jar with air holes poked by a nail. No one speaks loudly. You never thank the toad directly, it's bad luck. But Rika does offer a nod, respectful, like you might to a neighbor who helped you move furniture, but won't mention it later. Back home, the toad will be dried or kept alive depending on the purpose. Some parts might be used immediately, a wart cure involving a warm compress and mumbled prayer. Others will be stored toad powder for winter fevers, a leg bone charm for dreamless sleep, or in some cases, a necklace to ward off taxes. Again, unproven. And your quirky bedtime bonus: in one village in northern France, pond raids became such a local tradition that they were turned into an unofficial festival with songs, dancing, and the crowning of a toad queen. No actual toads were harmed that day, except for the one that sat on the winning girl's head. He was fine, just confused. So as you settle into rest, picture it: the soft splash of muddy water, the glow of a lantern through the reeds, and a hunched figure whispering sweet nonsense to a creature that doesn't speak but always listens. You don't have to believe in the magic for it to work. You just have to believe in the toad. The toadstone myth. You're seated on a creaky wooden bench in the back corner of a medieval jeweler's workshop. The air hums with the scent of hot metal beeswax and just a whisper of burnt onion, likely from someone's lunch, or an alchemical experiment gone sideways. On the counter before you lies a small velvet pouch. The jeweler opens it with practiced ceremony, revealing a pebble-sized gem. Pale, smooth, a little translucent. He leans in and whispers, "This one came from the head of a toad. Still warm when we pulled it out." You nod politely. You are unconvinced. Tonight's historical fact: for centuries, people across Europe believed in the existence of a magical jewel known as the toadstone, or bubonite, a gem thought to form inside a living toad's skull. It was said to to have incredible healing powers, most famously, the ability to detect and neutralize poison. Think of it as the medieval version of a security system. If your wine started to fizz or your soup changed color, the toadstone would warn you, or glow, or scream. Accounts varied. According to legend, the only way to retrieve the stone was to place the toad on a red cloth under the full moon and wait until the stone leapt from its head. Alternatively, some sources suggested you'd have to split the toad's skull open with a silver knife, but only if you had never committed sin, which really narrowed down the applicant pool. The toadstone became highly sought after by nobles' knights, alchemists, and ambitious quacks alike. It was embedded into rings, necklaces, and amulets often mounted in silver or set with protective runes. Some even carried it loose in their pockets, though that made it very easy to mistake for a snack in times of famine. Medieval priorities were flexible. There are inventories from royal treasuries listing a ring with the stone of the toad good against venom, as well as letters between physicians debating whether the stone should be worn over the heart or rubbed directly onto the wound. Spoiler, it didn't work either way, but that didn't stop anyone. Here's your delightfully strange detail of the night. Some versions of the myth insisted that a real toad must remain alive near the stone at all times to keep it awake. Otherwise, it would lose its powers and become just another shiny pebble. This resulted in some very fashionable nobles walking around with jewel-encrusted rings on one hand and small live toads in their coat pockets. History does not record how the toads felt about this. Naturally, forgers and tricksters leapt on the opportunity. Bits of agate fossilized teeth and oddly shaped pebbles were passed off as true toadstones. There's a wonderful 14th century complaint letter from a Flemish merchant who bought 2 true toadstones, both of which failed to scream when placed near vinegar. He demanded a refund. He did not get one. Meanwhile, genuine believers weren't deterred. Some even claimed their toadstones grew warm in the presence of dishonesty or trembled near witches. One scribe wrote that a toadstone he wore to a feast sang faintly when the meat was spoiled. Another claimed his glowed when his brother-in-law entered the room, though that may have been projection. You open another manuscript in the jeweler's collection. It's an herbal text, but in the margin, a monk has drawn a toad wearing a crown from which dangles a glowing gem on a chain. The toad appears unimpressed, possibly resentful. Underneath, someone has written, "He who wears the stone must thank the beast." A gentle reminder or a warning. Here's your scholarly debate for the evening. Was the toadstone purely myth, or did it originate from something real? Some historians believe the myth began with fossilized fish, teeth specifically from the genus Lepidotes, which were rounded smooth and occasionally found inside chalky riverbeds, often near ponds. These fossils were misinterpreted as toad skull stones, and the myth grew legs. And warts. Others suggest the idea came from ritualistic beliefs in sympathetic magic, where objects from inside animals were thought to carry powerful essence. The liver of a lion, the tooth of a wolf, the stone from a toad's head. It makes poetic, if not scientific, sense. One last curious tradition before we drift off in some rural areas. People believed that if you wore a toadstone ring and whispered a question to it before sleep, you'd dream the answer. This made toadstones popular among lovers' thieves and very indecisive shepherds. So tonight, if your dreams are filled with glinting stones, moonlit ponds, and smug little creatures guarding secrets beneath their skin, remember, the power wasn't ever really in the stone. It was in the belief, and possibly the toad's excellent PR. Sleep well, jewel seeker. The pond is always watching. Cures or curses, you're sitting beside a hearth in a dim medieval cottage, listening to the fire crackle and the wind sigh through the thatch. The room smells of time-burnt wool and something faintly amphibian. Across from you, an old woman stirs a clay bowl filled with what looks like mashed figs and smells like not figs. At her feet, in a lidded basket, something shifts with a wet little plop. You already know what's inside. She looks up, eyes sharp despite her years. I cured a man's fever with this mixture, she says, tapping the bowl. But after he dreamed only of crows. And now he won't eat turnips or look me in the eye. You nod respectfully. Welcome to the gray zone of medieval healing, the slippery overlap between cure and curse. Tonight's historical fact: throughout the Middle Ages, toad-based medicine was both respected and feared, not just for its physical effects, but for the strange aftermaths that often followed. People who used these treatments sometimes recovered and then never acted quite the same. This wasn't always a problem. But in a society where illness and sin were tangled together, a healing that came too quickly, too dramatically, or with unexpected side effects raised questions. Was the cure truly medicinal? Or had it crossed into something darker? Take, for example, a case recorded in the annals of a northern French parish in 1391. A man afflicted with heat in the brain was treated with a dried toad, crushed with vinegar, and sage applied to his temples. Within 3 days, his fever broke. Within 6, he began speaking in rhymes and claiming he could hear rats plotting beneath the floor. He lived another 20 years, never sick again, but also never quite invited to the local festivals. Or consider the case of the baker's daughter in Devon, treated for joint pain with a toad foot amulet wrapped in lambskin. Her pain vanished within the week, but afterward, she insisted her dreams were being narrated by a voice named Martin, who gave excellent advice on weather but terrible relationship tips. People didn't know what to make of these outcomes. In a time when medicine, magic, and morality swirled in the same cauldron, the line between helpful and harmful was less than clear. And anything involving a toad, a creature already associated with the uncanny, was ripe for suspicion. Here's where things get fun, or unnerving. A few people began to believe that toads didn't just absorb illness, they transferred something back. Not a disease, not a poison, something harder to name. Some called it a shadow, others a flickering. One text describes it as a coolness that makes mirrors fog for no reason. Not everyone agreed, of course. Plenty of healers stood by their cures. One famous herbalist in Prague wrote, "The patient must accept the full nature of the toad's wisdom. If they emerge changed, it is because they have seen the world as the toad sees it," which raises more questions than it answers. Now here's your charming historical oddity. A handful of recovered patients began keeping toads as pets. Whether out of gratitude or a warped sense of loyalty, these companion toads were said to be unusually obedient, often following their owners around the garden or sitting beside them at meals. One woman even knit her toad a tiny scarf for winter. The toad did not comment. The church, as expected, was divided. Some clerics decried the use of toads as opening a doorway to unseen realms, while others quietly kept toad-based powders in their own sick rooms just in case. After all, even a bishop with gout has his limits. Here's your scholarly squabble of the night. Some historians believe the rumors of curses stemmed from psychological responses to illness and fear. The mind, after surviving a disease, often rewrote the narrative to include mystery, meaning, or menace. Others argue that the side effects may have been real, caused by infections, poor hygiene, or even mild toxin exposure from the toad itself. But the truth is, probably both, with a bit of imagination sprinkled on top. You lean closer to the fire. The old woman finishes stirring her mixture, ties off the basket, and sets the bowl on the windowsill where the moonlight hits it just right. The mixture shimmers. Or maybe it just jiggles. You're not going to touch it either way. She smiles. Cured his fever, though, she says again. He doesn't dream of knives anymore. Good for him. And just before you drift off, one last peculiar tidbit. In parts of the Low Countries, there was a belief that if you were cured by a toad, you must never kill another. Doing so would bring back the sickness twice as strong and angry. So those who'd recovered walked carefully in the fields, whispering apologies to every frog and pebble just in case. So, sleep now, gentle soul. Let your worries drain into the earth, like rain soaking into a quiet pond. And if something croaks outside your window tonight, don't be afraid. It's just a follow-up visit. The apothecary's ethical crisis. You're in the back room of a medieval apothecary, part clinic, part storage closet, and part philosophical battleground. The air hangs thick with crushed thyme sour wine, and the unmistakable scent of something that once hopped, but now sits preserved in a jar. Wooden shelves bow under the weight of glass vials, dried herbs, and tiny bundles tied in string. Everything here whispers of intent. In the center of the room stands the apothecary himself, staring at a small bowl. He's holding a pestle in one hand, a shriveled toad in the other, and he's not moving. He's been in this exact pose for 23 minutes. People swear by it, he mutters. And yet, it's a toad. Tonight's historical fact: even among medieval healers, the use of toads in medicine sparked serious ethical debates. While some practitioners embraced the practice, others hesitated, not because they doubted the effect, but because they questioned the method. At what point does a cure become a compromise? Apothecaries, unlike traveling medicine sellers or folk healers, walked a tightrope. They were expected to be learned respectable and, above all, professional. That meant knowing when to grind a toad into powder and when to pretend you'd never heard of such a thing. The problem toad remedies worked, at least in the eyes of desperate patients. If someone came in with a fever that wouldn't break, or a boil that sang during full moons, it happens, and you gave them a dried toad plaster, they got better. Or thought they did. Either way, they paid you in eggs, wool, or silver buttons, and they told their neighbors. And business boomed. So what's the dilemma? This apothecary, let's call him Master Joris, is torn. On the one hand, he trained under a respected monastic order, learned to read Latin, and swore an oath to heal without deception. On the other hand, a merchant's wife claims his toad elixir cured her shingles, and her husband just offered to double his order and name his third child Joris Jr. That's a lot of pressure. You watch as Joris paces. The bowl waits. The toad waits. The ethics do not. He mutters, "Is this healing? Or theater?" Then louder, "Am I curing the body or soothing the mind?" Then louder still, "And how do I keep this from smelling like old swamp feet?" Valid questions all. This internal struggle wasn't unique. Many medieval apothecaries left behind letters marginalia and notes expressing hesitation about certain ingredients. Some simply refused to stock toads, instead offering plant-based substitutes like hyssop nettle or purified eel slime, which, let's be honest, wasn't much better. Others compromised by creating symbolic toad remedies, where the actual creature was never harmed, just represented. A toad-shaped root, a drawing under the bottle, or a chant that referenced amphibians in vague poetic terms. But then some went all in. Joris, however, remains stuck. One patient insists the toad cures his nightly tremors. Another claims her bad dreams stopped after a single dose. And a third, who may or may not be entirely sober, says the toad taught him patience. No further details given. He sets the bowl down. He sighs. People want hope. He says more to himself than to you. But is giving them hope through superstition worse than giving them nothing at all? That, dear dreamer, is the beating heart of this crisis. And here's your curious historical footnote. Some guilds issued informal guidelines for when toad remedies were allowed. If all else failed, if the moon was right, if the patient requested it specifically, if they brought their own toad. That last one was likely a joke. Likely. Joris picks up his pen and opens his ledger. He draws a small toad in the margin beside today's date and writes, "No charge." But if it helps tell no one, this wasn't shame. It was discretion. Because word gets around fast when you're the only apothecary in town who deals in amphibian miracles. And Joris isn't ready to be known as the Toad Man of Middle Street. Not yet. And now, your soft, slightly absurd bedtime detail. In one village, a healer decided to skip the moral question entirely by letting the toads decide. He'd place 3 jars on the counter. 1 with dried thyme, 1 with vinegar, 1 with powdered toad. Whichever jar the patient pointed to first, that was the ingredient he used. His success rate unknown. But he claimed it made things fair. So tonight, as you drift into that in-between place where logic gives way to instinct, picture a man in candlelight staring at a creature that never asked to be medicine. Picture the scales of ethics tipping gently back and forth. Picture the toad blinking slowly, as if to say, "You're the one with the thumbs, friend." Make the call. And sleep well, practitioner of thought. Not all cures come in bottles. Toads in trial records. You're seated in the drafty corner of a medieval courtroom. Stone walls, rough benches, and a judge who looks like he hasn't smiled since the last solar eclipse. A clerk scribbles furiously with a quill that squeaks against parchment. The bailiff sneezes. And at the center of it all, standing trial for her life, is a woman accused of witchcraft. And on the table beside her, a box. Inside the box, one very confused toad. Tonight's historical fact: during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, toads frequently appeared in witch trial records as evidence as accomplices, and occasionally as full-blown magical entities. Sometimes they were alive, sometimes preserved, sometimes described in language so theatrical it would make a playwright blush. According to the court, this particular toad was her familiar, a creature gifted to her by the devil, who allegedly appeared one rainy Tuesday and said, "Thou shalt keep this beast, and it shall do thy bidding." The toad naturally declined to comment. This wasn't an isolated case. In fact, dozens of trial records across France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and even Scandinavia include references to toads as potion ingredients, symbols of pacts, or supernatural sidekicks with names like Grumble Flax or Sir Thomas of the Swamp. No, really. Some believed witches used toads to cast illness onto their enemies, by placing them under beds, dropping them into wells, or tying their feet together with strands of hair and burying them at crossroads. Others accused women of feeding their toads human blood, either from a fingertip or an unspoken location. Everyone in court politely refused to name. And yet, curiously, the toad was never accused alone. Toads were always seen as extensions, proxies, tools of malice, but never independent actors. The question wasn't, did the toad do it? It was always, what did she tell it to do? This leads to our delightful and disturbing side note. Some trials included sworn testimony from neighbors who claimed the accused's toad glared at them, or followed them to market, or blinked in a threatening manner. One woman said a toad winked at her 3 times, and her cow gave sour milk for a week. Another claimed she woke to find one on her chest, weighing like the sins of Lent. You shift in your seat as the judge leans forward and asks, "And how long has the toad lived in your home?" The accused replies calmly, "Since before my husband died." "Did it speak to you?" "No, but it listens well." The clerk gasps. The judge clutches his rosary. The toad sneezes. Of course, not all references were so theatrical. Some trials mention toads in relation to healing. A woman might be accused not of harming others, but of using dried toads in poultices without church sanction. One healer in 15th century Burgundy was interrogated for selling amulets made from toad bones. Her defense: the bishop bought one last winter. Case dismissed. Here's your gentle academic squabble of the evening historians' debate whether the toad's presence in these records was rooted more in religious panic or long-standing folklore. Some argue that the church simply co-opted the toad's folk symbolism, muddy, secretive, slightly gross, and turned it into shorthand for corruption. Others point out that toads had been part of protective charms for centuries, and the shift from helpful to harmful was less about biology and more about control. You glance again at the court records stacked beside the clerk. One entry reads, "Item, a toad, was found among the woman's garments, wrapped in red thread, and wearing a tiny crown made of wax." The drawing in the margin shows a toad that looks frankly majestic, and yes, there were occasional moments of levity. In one German trial, the judge allowed the accused to keep her toad until after sentencing, provided it did not croak during Mass. In another, the toad was allegedly smuggled out of court by a sympathetic juror and released in a monastery garden where it lived to a respectable old age. You lean back as the current trial concludes. The toad is placed back in its box. The accused is led away. No verdict yet. But the toad, blinking slowly, unsentimentally, remains at the center of the drama. Not a witness, not a victim, not a villain, just there. And now, your curious nighttime tidbit. In some regions, toads were called listeners during trials. It was believed that they absorbed truth, and that if a toad refused to croak near someone, that person had something to hide. No one ever tested this thoroughly, probably for the best. So tonight, as you fall asleep, imagine a candlelit courtroom, the rustle of robes, the weight of silence, and a small, unimpressed creature blinking beneath its box lid. Judges come and go. Accusations change. But the toad abides. Herbalists versus toadologists. You're seated on a low wooden bench outside a village tavern, watching 2 figures stand nose to nose, well nose to beard, in a rapidly escalating disagreement. One is wrapped in robes that smell of mint elderflower and passive judgment. The other is in a patched leather apron that smells unmistakably of swamp. Both are holding baskets. One contains herbs, the other contains a toad. Welcome to the great professional rivalry of late medieval rural medicine, the herbalist versus the toadologist. Tonight's historical fact: as folk healing became more specialized in medieval Europe, tensions sometimes flared between those who relied on plants and those who leaned on more squishy solutions. Herbalists saw themselves as grounded in nature, drawing on centuries of botanical wisdom. Toad users, let's call them toadologists, even if that term only exists, here saw themselves as bold, practical, and not afraid to get their hands warty. The herbalist gestures to his sprigs of yarrow and says, "You think a pond creature understands inflammation." The toadologist snorts, "Your parsley hasn't cured a single boil this week." Mine croaked twice, and someone's gout vanished. And just like that, it's on. Herbalists had the church's partial approval. Plants were part of God's creation, studied by monks, written about in neat Latin, and grown in respectable cloisters. There were texts, herbals, bestiaries, compendiums, carefully documenting what each plant did or was believed to do. A leaf for this, a root for that, a flower for melancholy. And if it didn't work, well, maybe you picked it under the wrong moon phase. That's on you. Toadologists, on the other hand, often worked more underground, figuratively and literally. They weren't always illiterate, but they were definitely improvisational. Instead of citing books, they cited Aunt Mildred's miraculous recovery after rubbing a toad on her neck for 7 nights straight. They favored trial and error over theory, often messy, sometimes miraculous, frequently alarming. And then there were the patients caught in the middle. One woman swears by a poultice of mugwort and marigold for her migraines. Her neighbor keeps a dried toad foot in her bodice and hasn't had a headache in months. Coincidence, divine intervention, amphibious vengeance. No one agrees, and everyone has a strong opinion. Here's a particularly curious moment in the feud. A 15th century manuscript from central Germany records a series of debates held in village squares, where herbalists and toad users presented their cures and competed to win public favor. Each would treat a volunteer with some minor ailment, cough, swelling, stomach upset, and then wait a week for results. The winner got bragging rights and allegedly a jug of cider. The manuscript notes that the toad users often cured more rapidly, but the herbalists won more applause for their methods, were less distressing to observe. Academic historians love this stuff. Some suggest the rivalry reflects tensions between emerging professionalism and persistent folk traditions. Others argue it was just the usual medieval way of handling disagreements loudly publicly and possibly involving vegetables. Let's not pretend either side was perfect. Some herbalists were prone to overconfidence, diagnosing ailments by smelling a person's breath or examining the color of their spit against crushed violets. Some toadologists made remedies that caused more itching than illness ever did, but every so often, a strange kind of cooperation emerged. In one Swiss village, the healer's manual reads, "When fever is great use, elderflower with toad, but never let them touch directly. One may cancel the other." It's unclear whether this means the ingredients cancel each other, or whether the elderflower and toad had some kind of feud of their own. You look back to the scene outside the tavern. The two men are still arguing now, comparing patient outcomes and the size of their respective pouches. A small crowd has gathered. A goat wanders through utterly indifferent. And here's your whimsical side note. Before bed, some peacemakers tried to combine the two traditions. A recipe found in an Irish cottage reads, "Wrap the toad in mint, and time to calm the spirits and the smell." Another suggests placing dried toad in a pouch with lavender, so it does not disturb the dreams of those nearby. Because nothing says compromise like an herbal-scented amphibian. So tonight, if you dream of a garden and a swamp, a mortar and a net, and two very stubborn healers arguing over whose cure worked best, just smile. They may never agree, but between them, they kept the village alive. The slow decline of toad therapy. You're walking along the edge of a quiet marsh, the reeds swaying in the breeze, like gossip with better manners. The sun is low, casting long gold streaks across the water. You see ripples, maybe fish, maybe frogs, maybe a toad easing back into anonymity. Whatever it is, no one's trying to catch it. That's new. Because once upon a time, this would have been prime hunting ground for apothecaries, healers, desperate villagers, and the occasional ambitious alchemist with a burlap sack and a poem about pestilence. But now, the sack is empty. The poem's been replaced by a ledger. Tonight's historical fact: by the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the use of toads in European medicine began to decline slowly, then all at once. The little creatures, once central to so many cures and controversies, were quietly slipping out of apothecary jars and back into the underbrush. And it wasn't because anyone had a sudden change of heart. It was because medicine was changing. University-trained physicians were gaining ground. Scientific inquiry still wrapped in robes, and Latin began poking holes in older traditions. People started asking questions like, do we really know what's in that toad tincture? And what happens if we try literally anything else? Botanical gardens replaced kitchen plots. Microscopes replaced dreams. Anatomy lectures replaced herbal chants. And somewhere in all that progress, the toad simply stopped getting invited to the party. It didn't vanish overnight. For a while, it lingered in rural corners, in whispered traditions passed down like cookie recipes. A pinch of thyme, a sliver of garlic, a dash of dried toad for the stubborn cases. But in the cities, in the clinics with polished tools and measuring scales, the toad was no longer welcome. Part of this was optics. As medical texts were translated and printed more widely, toad-based treatments started looking unrefined. One Venetian doctor scoffed in print that only the poorest village quacks still rely on pond beasts and peasant superstition. Another wrote a treatise titled On the Errors of Bufonists, which, despite the dramatic title, is mostly just a long complaint about smell. And then there were the alternatives. As chemical compounds became more precise, healers could isolate what herbs did without having to mash it together with a former frog. You didn't need a toad to cure a cough when you had distilled laudanum or refined camphor. It was cleaner, predictable, less likely to escape under your bed in the middle of the night. You might think the toad went gently into that good marsh. But not everyone agreed it was time. In fact, in a few last stands across Europe, die-hard toadologists resisted the change. In parts of Brittany, healers refused to update their manuals. In the Bavarian Alps, there's a recorded incident of a woman throwing a toad at a traveling doctor who told her to modernize her cabinet. It did not help her legal case, or the toad. There were even elegies. One poem from 1604 begins, "No crown upon thy warty head, no praise for herbs thy skin hath bled, cast out by hands, now gloved and pale, they brew their cures and leave no trail." It wasn't good poetry, but it was heartfelt. And here's your curious bedtime tidbit. A few early modern naturalists tried to rehabilitate the toad's reputation, not as a cure, but as a subject of science. They began studying its life cycle, sketching it in journals, noting its habits. A French philosopher once wrote, "The toad robbed of its crown in medicine may yet wear one in nature." Not a bad career change. You step off the marsh path and spot an old apothecary bottle in the grass. Its label is too faded to read, but you know the shape. The glass is greenish, thick, imperfect. It once held something powerful, or at least something people believed was powerful. Now it holds a bit of rainwater, maybe a bug, maybe a story. That's how it goes. The toad didn't fail. It faded. Not because it didn't work, but because belief moved elsewhere, into cleaner jars, into books with gold leaf, into doctors with better handwriting. Still in some corners, a whisper remains. A farmer swears his grandmother never got sick because she kept a toad on the windowsill. A child ties a ribbon around a garden toad's middle, calling it her guardian. A healer retired, but still sharp, keeps a jar on her shelf, labeled for emergencies only. Inside, nothing but dust, or maybe something else entirely. So tonight, if your dreams take you to a marsh bathed in dusklight, and you hear a slow croak in the distance, know that it's not asking to be found. It remembers what it was, and it's happy to watch from the edge, because once it was medicine, and now it's legend. Lingering myths and TikTok toads. You're in the modern world now. Shoes on pavement instead of mud earbuds, instead of bells. Herbal teas instead of poultices. But somewhere between the buzz of fluorescent lights and the low hum of a phone vibrating on silent, you hear it. A croak, not loud, not insistent, just familiar. And suddenly, you realize the toad never really left. It simply adapted. Like all good survivors, it changed shape, slipped between the pages of time, and found new places to live. In memes, in legends, and lately on TikTok. Tonight's historical fact. While medieval toad medicine may be obsolete in the formal sense, many of its myths, charms, and fragments of belief continue to ripple through modern culture, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. The toad, once ground into powder, now floats through hashtags. Take, for instance, the modern fascination with witchcore cottagecore and the mysterious rise of frog and toad aesthetic. Teenagers knit sweaters with toads on them. Instagram accounts track pet toads and their daily moods. Etsy shops sell resin jewelry labeled toadstone protection rings, a callback, whether they know it or not, to the centuries-old myth of gems hidden inside a toad's skull. You smile. Some things really do hop in circles, but it doesn't stop at style. A few New Age wellness circles have begun dabbling in natural vibrational therapies, involving amphibians, no harm involved, just the idea that frog energy or toad spirit represents resilience, transformation, and the healing power of stillness, which, if you ask the toad, is probably a more dignified job than being steeped in wine and smeared on someone's forehead. And here's where it gets strangely familiar on social media. You'll find videos of people leaving offerings for toads, little crystals, tiny handwritten notes, miniature furniture. Some say it's for luck. Others say it's just cute. But at its heart, it's ritual. Soft, funny, harmless ritual. A 21st century version of the bread loaf beside the shrine. Just with more glitter, in folklore, podcasts, toad-related superstitions still get airtime, don't point at a toad or you'll get a rash. Never step over one, it brings bad dreams. If a toad jumps toward you, expect news. If it jumps on, you expect a TikTok. You check your phone and see a trending sound titled "Witch Toad Vibes." The video shows a toad sitting motionless while lo-fi beats play in the background. Thousands of likes, hundreds of comments. Someone writes, "I'd let this toad diagnose me emotionally." Another user posts, "He's seen things. He knows my secrets." And just like that, you're back in the marsh centuries ago, whispering into the ear of a squishy little oracle. But it's not all whimsy. Some environmentalists now use the toad as a symbol of ecological resilience. Campaigns to preserve wetlands feature slogans like, "Save the toads, they once saved us." Whether that's literal or poetic depends on who's printing the flyers. But the point stands, this humble warty creature still holds meaning. And meaning, as you've learned over 21 chapters of Dirt Dreams and Decoctions, is what gave the toad its power in the first place. You walk past a shop window, inside a crystal display. Among the amethyst and quartz, a little toad carved from green jade smiling slightly. It's labeled "Luck in Healing. Ancient Roots." You don't buy it, but you nod. And here's your quiet final mystery in one remote village, unnamed off the maps, reachable only by a path that doesn't appear until the fog rolls in. They still keep a shrine. Just stones, a circle, a hollow. And at its center, sometimes a toad, sometimes a dish of water. No explanations offered, no signs posted, but people leave things there. Bits of ribbon, buttons, a smooth stone with someone's initials scratched on the underside. Because even now, especially now, the world is loud and uncertain, and belief is less about knowing and more about holding something. Something ancient, something quiet, something that croaks when you least expect it. So tonight, if you scroll past a toad with a tiny crown and a million likes, or see a sticker that says "Bufonidae energy," or dream of a creature blinking slowly beneath moonlight and moss, remember this: he never left. He just changed platforms. And now, dear listener, the story slows. You've walked through muddy fields and musty apothecaries. You've sat beside fires where old women stirred strange brews. You've watched trials with silent toads as the only ones truly listening. And somewhere along the way, you might have noticed this wasn't just a story about frogs with warts and herbal confusion. It was about belief, about how humans fragile and determined will always reach for something just out of reach, be it cure, comfort, or meaning. Maybe the toad was never magical. Maybe it was. But in every story, it sat still and waited, asking nothing, promising nothing. And yet we kept returning to it. Not for what it did, but for what it held: mystery, resilience, and the kind of stillness we long for when the world spins a little too fast. So, wherever you are, curled up in bed, watching the curtain move gently with the breeze, or halfway into sleep, with one foot in a marsh and one foot in a memory, know this: you are safe. You are held. The strange stories of the past can rest with you tonight. You don't need to grind any toads, chant any charms, or sleep with garlic under your pillow. Just breathe, in and out, like ripples in a pond. And if you hear a little croak in the dark, let it be your lullaby. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.